you've got to find some way to break it down that you can now more intentionally pay attention to the various pieces that need to happen.
What you just heard was Andrew Hurd, the senior minister at EV Church, telling us that we need to break it down. Now, what does he mean by that? Why is it helpful for us to think about breaking it down? We're going to dig into these questions and more in this episode of the Reach Australia Framework podcast series. My name's Dave. I'm one of the consultants in the Reach Australia network. And as we've consulted with denominations, church leaders, and all sorts of people across Australian churches, what we've realised is that we need a framework to think about ministry. And that's what this podcast series is all about. You're in the 4th episode. Let me take you through our 5 episodes. You've got the first one. We looked at clarifying the big thing. Secondly, we talked about being faithful to inputs. And in our last episode, we talked about building and taking responsibility. This episode, it's all about breaking it down. And our next one, which is our last episode, we're going to be thinking ecosystems together. And as we've been telling you all the way along, there is an ebook that goes along with this podcast series. Just head to reachaustralia.com.au. You'll find all the links there. And a reminder too, you can get this on lots of different platforms. We're on YouTube as well as your favourite podcasting app. But right now, in this episode, we're going to be talking about breaking it down. What we're dealing with in this episode is trying to get to a sufficient level of granularity in your ministry, a place where you can assess in close detail with what's actually going on. Now, there are lots of different ways that you can break the ministry down, break that big thing down. But we want to talk together today about 2 ways that you can break it down. The first one is you can think about that 5-sided diagram and look at your ministry through that lens. Let's throw back to Andrew Hurd now, who helps us think about this concept just a little bit more.
Break it down. You know, someone tells you to build a bridge, and what do you say? I mean, you say to yourself, I can't even make my bed, make a bridge. What are you talking about? But, you know, someone says build a bridge. Where do you go next? You break down the task. You put it down into parts that you can now move forward on. The Lord Jesus calls on us to make disciples, mature disciples, holy disciples. What do you do with that? Well, break it down. Now, there's a number of ways to think about breaking it down, and one of the ones that we've often used is the pentagon. And you'll see it emerge up here. It's a way of conceiving the component parts of what goes into making a mature disciple, starting to kind of break down the big thing into parts. Deep in the word, you'll notice at the bottom there, it's the thing that flows over everything. It's the word that is the fountain for everything else that happens. There's a primacy to the word. But it's not just the word. We need to work towards having people love God. Not just understand things, but actually be brought to respond to God in prayer and praise, in repentance and obedience. Be humbled before Him. Now, in our context here, we call that magnification. Don't use the word, use some other word. Find some way to think about those things. But we need to care about seeing people not just deep in the word, but deep in the word that they might be lifted up to see the greatness and glory of God and be humbled by that and captivated by Him to prayer, praise and so on, to have this deep engagement of life with God as our Father. We need to do that together. Ephesians chapter 4, it's a community activity of growing together. We need to capture people to the importance of community. It's not an individual thing, it's a corporate thing together. Make sure that's part of the way people think. But then, of course, they need to be brought into serving. To serve one another, to serve those outside, to be servants, glad, sacrificial servants. And finally, of course, to be on mission. As Gary drew attention to, as you come close to God, the heart of God, who sent His Son to seek and save the lost, you can't help but then wanting to be captured by that, to be one who serves as well in bringing the gospel to others.
Well, churches are complex beasts, aren't they? and it can feel really overwhelming to sort of think about what's actually going on here. It can sort of feel, I guess, like you trying to put up a tent on a windy day. I don't know whether you've ever tried to attempt putting up a tent by yourself, let alone in the wind. You sort of get one rope nice and tight, and then you sort of go around to the other side and try and get that tight, and the wind starts to blow, or that rope starts to sort of get a little bit looser, and you're sort of constantly going from one aspect to the next. It's so complex to try and get right. And we can feel like that as we try and run churches. We're running here, we're running there, we're trying to fix it all up. It's quite complex. I used to coach tennis for a living. Now, tennis is quite a complicated game in terms of how you move around the court, how you actually conduct all the different strokes, and there's many. There's forehands, backhands, there's volleys, there's the serve. And when I first started coaching, I would try and focus on absolutely everything. Let's try and get all these bits in a very small sort of time frame. You've got a half an hour private lesson. Let's do all these things. And I'd wonder why they weren't getting any better. And so what I realized I needed to do was I need to actually break down all the different elements. So one day we'd focus on forehands, but a particular aspect of the forehand, or even in the serve, probably the most complicated aspect of tennis. Let's get the ball toss in the right position. Let's practice that. Here's a couple of drills. Let's get the racket in the right position. Let's get our shoulders moving in the right particular sorts of way. I had to break it down in order that we could start to sort of build that complex game of tennis back together. Now, churches are the same. We know the big thing. We heard that in episode 1. Make mature disciples in ever increasing number. But we can't leave it there. It's too big. We need to start to think about what it looks like to break down this mature disciples in ever increasing number, to get to that point of sufficient granularity where we can assess and figure out what's actually going on, and then start to think about how do we sort of fix those things. One of the most helpful ways that we've started to see that you can break church down is towards that 5-sided diagram, those 5 particular purposes. Let's hear from Derek Hanna and Madeline Galea from Geneva Push as they explain a little bit more of these 5 outcomes by which we can start to break the big thing down.
Now, Reach Australia has a set of biblical values, our outcomes that we've identified. We've put all the information in the links in the show notes, but what we've tried to do is capture the framework of understanding what a fully formed disciple looks like in the context of the local church. In this understanding, the fully made disciple is on mission, is serving, deep in the word, Godwardly attentive, and all of this has a corporate dimension.
Now, we'll make this available and you can read up more. I think this is a helpful clarification, helpful assembly of some of the key themes that we see in the Bible. It's driven, it's powered by the word. There's mission, there's service, there's Godward attentive, there's corporate. Now, it may be people identify other streams, other themes within it. That's absolutely fine. This is principles drawn out of the Bible. This is not the Bible itself. And so I've seen other people talk about it. So there's aspects of different aspects that they would put in there. Yeah. Absolutely fine. But where you're trying to go with this as you're articulating it, each of these biblical values here, you're trying to get them in such a place where they reflect both the Bible themselves, but can connect with the people that you're communicating them to. And then you can see in these diagrams, they're broken down into the different biblical aspects that make them up. And once you've articulated them, they then begin to inform the biblical values, the framework and the goal, the present and the future, that you will structure your church around. They shape and inform us as to how and what we do, as well as beginning to give some tangible outcomes for what it is we're going to track to see whether we're actually moving towards this vision in the way we've agreed that we need to move forward.
Yeah.
Well, that is one way for us to think about how to break down this big thing, thinking through the lens of the 5 purposes, that 5-sided diagram. And we start to see it's really, really quite a helpful way in which to start to break things down, but it's not the only way to break things down. You can also do that through thinking about your church as a pathway. And there's lots and lots of different ways you can start to think about your church as a pathway. And lots of Australian churches are doing lots of different things in this space. The first one, I guess, that's out there is what's called the 4 E's as a way to think about working their way through church. Another one, a lot of churches use connect, grow, serve, and some even put go at the end. The big principle that we're trying to capture here with this pathway is, remember, getting to that point of can we actually sort of start to assess in some detail with what's actually going on in our church. So, thinking about church as a pathway. Let's hear from Greg Lee, the senior minister at Hunter Bible Church, as he explains a little bit more about breaking down our church into pathway thinking.
Working well. So there's that first point of contact. How do people hear about us and how do they decide to come along? Which then means their first sort of interaction with us, their first connection with us, which is going to be often of a Sunday. But if they're not a Christian, their first interaction with us is often going to be with something like life. And so the pathway does actually have 2 streams. There's the stream for the person who's not a Christian yet and the person who is a Christian yet. Let's start on the Christian person. There's that point of contact where they hear about us and decide to come along. There's that first interaction with us. And then there's the joining part, where for us they come along to our program where we tell them what we're on about, what we're passionate about, what we believe, what we want for them. And then they move into the life of the church, which is belonging in the community, being part of a growth group, and beginning to do ministry and to do evangelism with us. That's the pathway for the Christian. For the non-Christian, we're going to come into contact with them, often for us, because we've got this long-term established life program. They're going to come in at life, not even at church yet. And they'll be involved in life, the first one. They'll hear the gospel. They'll often move a fair way towards making a decision. But what we've discovered is people are staying so far back that it usually involves a second program, a second dose. And there are people sort of loving them all the way through. As they become Christians, they'll go into the joining process. We want them to know what they're joining as a church, and then they'll move into the life of church.
Really helpful to hear from Greg as he unpacks pathway thinking in terms of breaking down the big thing. As we examine this pathway compared to the average Australian church, and we've been working with lots and lots of churches all around Australia, we can start to do some assessment together as to sort of what it actually starts to look like in the average Australian church. Let's start with raising awareness. And what we find here is that most people don't even know where their local church is. When we think about first contact, we start to see that it's hard for people. They don't know what their next step is from that first contact. Again, a lot of churches don't have this break between that sort of pathway for the Christian changing churches or the person who comes in who's not yet a Christian. So, there's no particular sort of here's your next step if you're in this particular bracket. Now, as we think about that conversion piece, there's lots of momentum starting to get built around courses that churches are running, which is really great. We'd love to see more and more of that. But what we're not seeing is the follow-up that happens in any way. And then when we start to think about coming down to that integration piece, after that first contact, we start to see, there's not a lot of membership moments, or if they do have something that says this is what it means to be a member of our church, it's a long, long way away from that first point of contact. And then we look to get people as part of church life. And then we start to think about the growth. We see there's lots of good small groups. There's lots of energy, lots of focus, lots of resources going in here. And that's great. And we want to see that keeping on going. But when we start to think about serve, there's often not a formal process where people can start to jump on board and serve. And then when we start to think about sending, there's not a lot of people heading to MTS or overseas. And so what we're starting to see is there's particular areas around the pathway that need work for the average Australian church. We know that, every church is different. Every church will have, unique strengths and weaknesses. But that's part of, what we're starting to see as we do this is the urgency for mission. A lot of churches really struggling on the mission pieces of the pathway, which is why this podcast framework series exists. We want to help leverage and get mission really firing across lots of Australian churches, not ignoring the good stuff that's already happening, but really starting to get those pieces firing. But what you're starting to see is the beauty of pathway thinking. The idea that you can get that sufficient level of granularity, to assess and go, what's happening over here in raising awareness? Is it going okay? How's our first contact? All those bits start to become super, super helpful as we start to think about breaking it down. So what we've started to see is that beauty and joy of pathway thinking, but that's not the only way to think about a pathway. Let's go back to that big thing. Make mature disciples in ever-increasing number. Now, again, we've seen that's too big. What we need to do is continue to break that down. And so another way to sort of think is you can talk about getting new disciples and growing new disciples. So again, two big things that sit underneath those. But again, that's still probably too big, even though they're helpful terms for us to think about. What we want to do is to think about another layer that sits underneath that. So when we think about getting new disciples, what we want to do is we want to start to break that down even further. And there's multiple ways you can start to do that. There's a layer that sits under get. Firstly, we want to contact them, get to know them. Then we secondly want the opportunity to share the gospel with them, with the hope and prayer that under God that they would be converted. But our job doesn't stop when they've been converted. We want to establish them in the faith, give them the groundings that they need. And in the same way as we start to think about growing disciples. So we've got this get, that's a layer there, and then under grow, we've got another layer that sits under there. We want to, as someone starts to come into that space, we want to establish them in church. But again, that's not the only thing. There's a second part to it. We want to mature them, get them deep in the word, get them into small groups. But we also want to get them serving, in a team working towards a particular purpose. But we also want to get them on mission to help them figure out what it looks like for their friends to come to know Jesus. So there's a layer there that sits under get, that sits under grow, but even under all those particular ones in that get and grow and the layer that sits there, there's another layer that sits below. We can break down those things even further. And so what you start to see again is we're getting to that sufficient place of detail where we're breaking down the big thing. Make mature disciples, get them, grow them, and the layers that sit underneath each of those things. So there's two ways which we can break down this big thing. The first one we looked at was through that 5-sided diagram, looking through the lens of that to sort of try and break things down. And then we looked at pathway thinking, and again, there was two aspects there. There was that pathway that went across from that first awareness through to sending. And then we've just seen the other way to break down in terms of the pathway in the get-grow model. So we've been thinking here about breaking things down. But as we've done this, there's all sorts of misconceptions that we want to push to the side and say, hey, this isn't what's actually going on here. The first one is breaking it down is not about breaking things down into component ministries.
And I want you to notice here, this is quite critical. What I'm talking about is not breaking down your work into component ministries. I'm not saying break it down into Sunday morning, Sunday night, youth group, Sunday school. I'm not saying break it down into component ministries. I'm wanting us to operate at a higher level, a conceptual level. Put aside the things you're doing to run church and step back further from it and say, what am I trying to achieve? What's actually meant to be going on here? What are the big things I'm about? Well, make disciples. But to make mature disciples, I need to achieve these next order things of being deep in the Word, Godward attentive, being community together as God's people, serving, loving, and ministering to the world around me, bringing the gospel to the world around me. There's the kind of conceptual thing I'm wanting to be achieving in my work. Now, once you appreciate that, whatever your part, whatever it is, but break it down, and now you've got the ability to be intentional.
The second misconception and myth we want to bust at this point is that breaking down and using pathway thinking and those things, it's not just about big church thinking.
No. Everything we've been talking about in terms of ecosystems and pathways, they're not size dependent. They're in every single church. So there is a pathway, a discipleship pathway in every church, and there is an ecosystem in every church. The difference between small church and large church will be a difference in complexity and maybe the ability to staff it. But you've got an ecosystem when you've got 6 people, when you've got 3 people. And so you need to be thinking about this regardless of size. But here's the thing, the earlier you start thinking about it, the easier it is to overcome those growth barriers. And so I think this is a bit of a cart before the horse thing. Often people look at it and look at big churches and see this ecosystem thinking and think, they're doing the ecosystem thinking because they're big. It's actually the other way around. Part of the way they manage to grow is by attending to the ecosystem thinking early.
The third misconception is that this is just a staffing structure. Again, we want to bust this together.
You can resource towards it. Now notice too, this is not a staffing structure. This is not a big church structure. This is simply a conceptual map about what you're trying to achieve in sufficient detail that I can pay attention to each part.
The fourth misconception we want to deal with is that pathway thing, it's mechanical, it's prescriptive, it's just unloving. How can you sort of love someone well if you're just sort of trying to plug them through these particular aspects? Again, we want to really sort of say that's not true. Let's hear from Greg.
Well, partly the reason we want to work hard at identifying it is because it exists, and it can either be really loving for people or really unloving. So just thinking about one part of the pathway, which is connecting people in, people will connect in with your church, but it'll either be loving to them or unloving. A loving connection will look like people will meet other people, they'll hear about what the church is on about, they'll be individually cared for, they'll be shown how to join well. An unloving one is just going to let all of those things take care of themselves. It's happening regardless, but it can be unloving or loving.
Well, Greg's given us some really helpful things there as he speaks that the pathway is actually really a loving thing to do because it's about intentionality, and helping that new person know what happens next is a really actually loving thing to do. And you've got a pathway, whether it's a good one or a bad one or a loving or unloving one, it exists anyway in your church. Well, after the break, we're going to keep talking about church pathways. Don't forget, at the very end of the episode, we've got some Australian church music for you to listen to. And then after that, at the very end, we've got a bonus resource for you from our Executive Director, Scott Sanders. It's worth sticking to the very end to check that out.
I want to announce the 2022 Reach Australia National Conference. It'll be on the 16th to 19th of May at EV Church on the Central Coast. And after 2 years, we're finally able to gather in one location, getting together as a network to really press into the goal of reaching Australia for Christ. As always, the National Conference will provide theologically driven, practically oriented, proven tools for gospel workers to be able to translate into their own ministry contexts. We'll have talks, panels, workshops, consultations with experienced ministry practitioners, the opportunity to reflect as a team, networking, and to pray together. These 4 days will clarify, stimulate, inspire, and encourage all who attend for the task at hand, making disciples of all the nations. Over the 4 days, we're going to be looking at one of the key purpose areas, serve. Andrew Reid's going to be opening up the Bible, and Paul Harrington will be sharing his ministry experience. We'll be answering questions such as, how do we build teams? What does it look like to raise up leaders and build ministry layers across all of church life? What are the key systems and processes that we need to unleash the saints for good works? Over the 4 days, we're going to keep coming back to this idea, wrestling with what does it look like to have a church where people are joyfully serving and loving one another. Registrations are now open, so go to reachaustralia.com.au. Looking forward to seeing you in 2022.
Welcome back. You're in episode 4 of the Reach Australia Framework podcast series. The first part of this episode, well, that contained heaps of information. So I'm keen for us, let's slow down a little bit here and let's start to think together about how to apply this to our church context. We're going to throw back to Greg Lee now, who's going to help us unpack a little bit more about how this pathway thinking impacts our church thinking.
We need to know how people are going to get in contact with us or find out about us. And in a new church, it might be that you're going to do some advertising, but fundamentally it's through connections that people already have. It's through invitation. Then the next part is, from the first time they interact with us to joining, what experience do we want them to have? What do we want them to know about us? What decisions do we want them to make about us so that they join us really intentionally? Then the next part of the pathway is, how do we want them to live with us as part of the family? What should that look like? So for instance, it'll mean being in a growth group. It'll mean joining a ministry team. It'll mean serving the people in their growth group in their normal daily life. It'll mean evangelizing their friends. Recognizing that there's a journey that people go on from first contact to being in ministry with us, and how do we help people along the way. One helpful thing that we've used here is we've got these purposes. We want to put a person in charge of each bit of the pathway, and they're going to run a program that makes it work well. So as you draw our pathway, we'd say this guy runs this bit, this guy runs this bit, this guy runs this bit, and they run these kind of programs, and they're always talking to each other about how do we move people from my part of the pathway to yours, my program to yours.
Such a helpful clip from Greg there. And one of the things that really sort of struck me is that, when we're thinking about pathway thinking, what we're doing and asking people to help along with it, we're not asking people to pastor the whole thing, but just a small and little bit along the way of someone's journey. Really, really helpful. But there's another helpful piece of good news, is that communicating the pathway is easier than you think. Let's throw back to Greg.
I think you do it well by just communicating the next step. So from our point of view, we're in the helicopter above the whole thing, and we see the complexity. We see, all the different bits and where they're not working. From the point of view of the person who's joining church, they experience it relationally. And so you just say, look, the next step for you is we'd love you to come along to this. And then once you've done that, the next step is someone's going to get in contact with you and they're going to invite you along to this. And so communicating it is actually much easier than building it, because you don't need to communicate the whole thing. You just need to communicate where people go next.
Well, I'd love to tell you a little bit about my own journey with breaking it down. And each time we've gathered, I've shared just a little bit about my own story and ministry and how it interacts with some of these aspects of the framework. And so I've told you a little bit about my own church planning journey. And if I think about breaking it down in that context, I really didn't break much down at all. In fact, what I did was react to what was going on. And so new people would walk in the door and you'd sort of go, oh, they're a Christian from another church. Well, that's great. You're in. Let's just get you into a small group as quick as we possibly can. And I'd react to that. Or someone would come in and go, I'm not a Christian. I'm like, we got to help you figure it out, who Jesus is. And I'd sort of run a course for them. I wasn't really breaking it down. I was just reacting to whatever was going on around me. Now, obviously, when I finished college, I took on a fairly traditional assistant minister's job and was given responsibility over the evening congregation. And again, I didn't really break things down, but what happened was that church grew to be passionate about the things that I was passionate about. And so I was passionate about mission, and so we'd run a few courses, and that was great. But meanwhile, some of the small groups would start to suffer, and the leadership in them wasn't actually sort of growing, and I wasn't training them or developing them. I was pretty passionate about MTS, and so I got MTS up and off the ground, which was great. But then all my sort of energy started to get focused in there, and mission started to sort of dwindle away. And so, again, I wasn't really breaking things down. I was sort of looking at that sort of big task in front of me and just sort of going, here's some things I'm pretty keen about and pretty passionate about. And church started to look like me. But then I changed jobs and started to look after, get even more responsibility, I guess, a congregation that looked a little larger. And I started to think, actually, I need to start to have some ways in which different aspects of what needs to happen in church is starting to happen. And so I started again, and I started to use some of the principles of breaking it down. And so I'd have someone who's responsible for this area of church and that area and so on and so forth. I'd start to meet with them and try and lead through them to sort of see how church could operate well. I then had the opportunity to go to the US, which was a lovely thing to do. And what I really wanted to do is actually figure out how some of the larger churches started to break things down. I got quite interested in organisational charts and who's doing what, how do they start to work and operate and function, so that at the church that I was serving, we would, have the opportunities to think about best practice across all those things. Because as that started to happen, I was starting to think more deeply about this principle of the framework of breaking it down. Now, you're perhaps a faster learner than I am, because I was pretty slow, and there was times where God had to humble me in order to say, you got to break things down, you got to build and take and give responsibility to other people rather than doing it yourself. But the break it down principle was so helpful once I grasped it, to actually start to think about what's happening in each area, how's it going in there, and it's a principle I'm hoping that you will take with you and use in your churches and in churches right across Australia. Well, let's drive this episode to a close, shall we? We have been examining break it down. We've got our big thing, and we've seen there's all different ways in which you can start to break things down, with the principle being, let's get things to a sufficient level of granularity where you can assess and figure out what's going on in each aspect across church. I'm hoping you can join us next time. Next time we're going to look at ecosystem thinking. What's an ecosystem? What's it got to do with church? But it's such a crucial part of the framework. It's one that you must not miss as we've started to unpack this framework for ministry. As we drive to the end, we're about to head in to the Australian church music that we're going to showcase. But don't forget, after that song, to stick around and hear from Scott Sanders, the Executive Director of Reach Australia, as he has a bonus resource for us in thinking about pathways. God bless. See you next time.
For I say, you became poor, born as a lowly babe. Oh, what cost? You gave it all, a ransom for many paid. This is how we know. This is how we know what love is. This is how we know. This is how we know what love is. This is how we know. This is how we know what love is. This is how we know. This is how we know what love is. This is how we know what love is. You laid down your life, broken at the hands of sinners. This is how we know. This is how we know what love is. You laid down your life, broken at the hands of sinners. This is how we know.
Hey, it's great to see that you are still with us. Really hope you enjoy this bonus resource from Scott Sanders.
G'day, I'm Scott Sanders, and I want to give you a quick tool on pruning your pathway. The disruption that COVID has brought has given us the opportunity to look with fresh eyes at how we move people towards maturity in Christ, help people take their next steps. So I want to help us in this video think about our discipleship pathway, to look at it with fresh eyes as we think about managing the outcome of seeing people become mature in Christ. Now let me just map it out for you now really quickly on the whiteboard. Okay, I want to use this tool to help you ask 5 key questions about how people are discipled in your church life. So the first thing to do is actually to document this process. Now, this is looking a lot simpler than what would ordinarily take place in the average church. This is where I want to get you, but when you first document your pathway and your process, what I want you to do is assess and look at everything that actually disciples someone. So if we just simply look at this diagram, what's on there so far? I want you to think about the Christian and the path they take into your church. I also want you to think about the non-Christian. Think about how are they contacted, and then how do they connect with Christians and with Christianity in your church. This section here in the diagram is what I call the integration engine. So it's how someone moves from being a cold contact to being connected in with the life of the church, to then becoming a member or connecting with a course or a one-to-one relationship or an opportunity where they actually have the gospel explained and communicated to them. We want to see people move through the process so to become members in the life of the church, becoming part of a small group, serving in the life of the church, regularly giving and regularly attending church. Now, the reality is it's not necessarily a linear process. People are going to move in and around, and there's going to be a whole bunch of inputs impacting someone as they move into the life of the church. So rather than giving you a linear process here, I really want to point out that it's actually a community, or it's the whole of church. It's an ecosystem. We want to see people deep in the Word. We want to see people Godwardly attentive. We want to hear people joyful and thankful, repenting and trusting Jesus, being prayerful in their life. We want to see people serving in the life of the church. So using their ministry gifts, seeing the body function really effectively. We want to see people part of a community. We have a number of structures where people can care, connect, and be really involved in the life of the church. And then finally, we want to see people on mission. Now, the reality is it's going to take a whole ecosystem to do that. And it's also not a simple linear process of moving across from one step to another step to another step. But this pathway process helps you just document some of the key moments. So the first question that I want to ask is, what is the goal? We want to see someone become mature in Christ. And so I want you to think about a person in your church. What is the goal or the outcome for that person? We want to see them become Colossians 1:28, mature in Christ. What does that look like? Have a discussion with your team about what the mature member looks like in your church. Secondly, as you're sitting down with your team as well, you perhaps might want to ask this question. What ministries are growing people in your church? What ministries have grown you in this church? And as you think about them, start mapping them out on this discipleship pathway. Start filling them out. I think one of the first things you do as you document, you'll tend to see that church life is really complex. In fact, most churches tend towards complexity. Now, the problem with a full discipleship pathway is that ministries start to compete. The problem in most churches is that we tend to add rather than subtract ministries. So we've started ministries and then we've started other ministries. We haven't actually stopped other ones. So this is a process to start thinking through which ministries we're going to prune, which ministries have been unfruitful, which ministries actually aren't helping people grow, which ministries are things that we do and we like to do and they've had a historical reason, but they're actually not achieving our end outcome of actually seeing people mature in Christ. The disruption that we've got at the moment gives us the opportunity to prune those things as well. The other problem with a complex church is that people are competing for teams and ministry. And as we have more activities happening in the life of the church, we find that we just don't have enough volunteers to actually run ministries well. So the path will tend to show you that you tend towards complexity. You want to prune. You want to take the opportunity to be intentional. What ministries are actually going to move people in? Now, as you are thinking and assessing this pathway, the other thing I want you to think about is, do we have a front door or a back door problem? What do I mean by this? If we've got a front door problem, we're not connecting with non-Christians or Christians in our community who aren't going to church. So how do we identify if we've got a front door problem? Well, generally over the course of 12 months, you'll see the same number of people that averagely attend your church on a Sunday. So say you're a church of 150. Over the course of the year, I think a healthy church will see between 150 to 200 visitors or first-time guests in your church. If you've got a healthy integration process, if this section here in the diagram is actually working well, you'll see 20% of those first-time guests, those newcomers, actually connect in with the life of the church and become members in the life of the church. So as you think about whether you've got a front door problem, look at your contact strategies and look at your connect strategies. Do we have a great website that's making people know that they're the church they don't go to? Are we intentionally creating opportunities for people to be inviting people to church and to be inviting people into some of these ministries that connect them in with the life of the church? Are we making the most of some of the unique things about our church? So think into your growth, the growth engines on your church. Why is it that people come to your church? And start to maximise those so that people are aware of them. The second part of that, the connect side of things, have a think into how you can connect people with Christianity or with Christians, and that's where this integration engine comes. So do you have a front door problem? Or do you have a back door problem? So a back door problem is that people are coming in, you've got no problem with connecting with lots of people, but they're actually not sticking. They're not actually becoming a part of the church. Now that's a more complex question. You need to think about the whole ecosystem. And I don't think it's just one or two things. Often I think the reason we have a problem with our back door is that our systems are so complex. And so we've got potentially 2 or 3 systems for connecting someone in, or a number of different groups here, which means it's hard for the individual to know simply how to make their next step. So this will help you clarify your discipleship pathway so that you can start to communicate that really clearly to the members of your church, but also those who are coming to your church for the first time. So use this to clarify and then use this to connect as well. So do you have a front door or a back door problem? The final thing I want to say just in this piece is to think about, is there someone who is accountable for this process? So is there someone in the life of the church, a lay member or a staff member, who's actually thinking about how someone moves from step to step to step? Often where we lose people in this system is in these transition moments where we get a connect form or a contact form. We assess whether they're a Christian or non-Christian. We lose them in this, in this transition step, or we lose them in this transition step. We lose them here. So having someone accountable for that whole process and thinking about this person as an individual is really helpful, ensuring that we actually don't lose people. Okay, so you've thought about the goal. You sat down a team and you've asked what ministries are actually growing our people. You've documented it. You now need to prune. You now need to take some things off. Now, one of the things that we're seeing regularly with churches is the need to be really simple with this discipleship pathway. So think through the journey for a Christian, think through the journey for a non-Christian. For a non-Christian, we want to connect them with Jesus. So what courses, programs, events are going to enable someone to intro and find out more about Jesus? Now, the reality is this little step here is not 1 or 2 weeks, it's not one moment, it's probably about 20 weeks. So what are the courses that you're going to be putting people to? What are the number of multiple steps that are going to happen? If you're a Christian, we want to quickly assess that, and we want to give you a member moment. We want to give you the opportunity. We actually want to give you the opportunity to work out, is this the church that is going to be your home? That could be a Sunday lunch, that could be a membership course, that could be online, that could be a number of weeks. But you want to actually help people know when they become a member of the church. Now, often this step from someone becoming a Christian to becoming a member, it's not a simple line. There's probably a number of steps that are going to take place. And they might make that step, hey, yeah, this is my church, before they've necessarily done a membership course. But it's worthwhile documenting that and working out a process so that people aren't making that call for themselves. And then that next step, they understand what it means to become a member of the church. We actually want to move them into some critical structures for discipleship. So those critical structures are obviously our gatherings, our regular weekly gatherings, some sort of small group structure, and ministry teams. We want to get people being part of a group, serving, and then giving to the body of Christ. So, very simple tool. Start to think through what those are. Now, I said clarify, and I also said communicate. You want to now, with this simplicity here, start communicating to your church those simple next steps that people make. One of the simple ways to do that is on a Sunday, have regularly 2 announcements. The first one is, hey, if you're here for the first time and you want to find out more about Jesus, we've got a great course, or we've got someone you can meet with and connect with who can help you find out more about Jesus. That's starting next week. Or come and see someone at the welcome table at the back of the church after the service. Or if you're here and you want to make this church your home, in the next month we've got a newcomers dinner, or we've got a membership course. That's a really great next step for you to become part of this church. So, think about the goal, ask what ministries are growing people, document that path, and prune. Churches tend towards complexity, so take things off so you can be intentional about making disciples. We want to prioritise the path and help people keep making steps towards becoming mature in Christ.